We're going to call this the Please Don't Hate Me Rumination, for two reasons. One, for those of you who were there for the final day of streaming, I decided to go ahead and record this before I went and get lunch, because I wanted to get all my thoughts out while they were still fresh and vibrant in my mind, rather than, just letting them sit and possibly forgetting something. Sorry, don't hate me. The second reason is for anybody who really likes this game. Please don't hate me. First thing I want to talk about is how interesting it's been over the years of reviewing. I've been doing this for a while now, about 2 years of the current review format. And one of the things I've noticed is that there's a game that doesn't score particularly well that is crap. And then there's a game that doesn't score particularly well, but you can see why people like it. Maybe it's got some unique concepts, or maybe the good aspects of the game outweigh the bad aspects of the game. Or maybe it's just unique in some way or another. Maybe it just does something that other games don't. One of the reasons I played Star Wars Rebellion for so long, despite the fact that that game honestly kind of sucks, is because it's really the only Star Wars 4X game. And that was interesting to me. Until the Stellaris mod came out, of course, but you get my point. So I get it. I understand completely. And this game does a lot right, and has some really cool concepts, and comes close to having one of the best story aspects of a Pokemon game I've ever seen. So, I can completely understand why people love this game. It just didn't score all that well, because it's got all the other things in the way. Let's go ahead and start by talking about the gameplay, shall we? And I could talk about a lot of things in the gameplay, but let's just go ahead and get this out of the way right off the bat. I didn't like the randomized dungeon design thing. You might think, oh, lore, and then you might stab me, and that's acceptable. I'm not really into roguelikes or roguelites, with exceptions. There are a few that I like. I like Rogue Legacy. FTL is enjoyable. There's Into the Breach. That's a good one. I, of course, like Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. But otherwise, I'm not super into the franchise, or the genre. But that's not the problem I had. Because my problem wasn't the fact that it was randomly designed dungeons. It was the fact that the randomly designed dungeons weren't really designed. Let me talk about the combat first. The combat in this game is what I would refer to as excellent. You take the already interesting and fascinating builds gameplay of Pokemon. You got your Pokemon, you got your moves, you got your abilities and your items and all sorts of other stuff. And you have all sorts of combinations and things you can do with it. But at its core, Pokemon is still a duel simulator. 1v1. It's one of the reasons I've said for years that Pokemon needs to branch out and allow party combat, because once you allow a party, all of a sudden the lid is just completely thrown off, right? All of a sudden combos and support and backups and just there's so many different things, tactically speaking, that you can do. And here we have a game where you can have 4 Pokemon out at once. So already we're getting into that. But hang on, they add another dimension to it. Terrain. So it's flat terrain, so it's not actually terrain in the strictest sense. But the point is there's a grid. You have 4 Pokemon on the grid there, and you've got the enemies up here. And now all of a sudden positioning matters. All of a sudden range matters. Whether or not your attack will attack through the enemy, or whether it'll hit the whole room, or whatever. All of these things are suddenly new variables on top of the party size, on top of the existing Pokemon combat. I cannot praise this enough. This is such a cool concept that I had more fun with this, beating this game, than I did in my entire playthrough of Pokemon Conquest, which I actually ended up putting down due to sheer boredom. One of these days I might come back to that game, I don't know. So I'm with it. Yes, that's awesome. That is such a cool thing, and I love every moment of it, except I totally don't. Why? Because nothing benefits that. We have a very awesome, in my opinion, core combat mechanic, which is not buoyed, but is instead burdened by 2 major things: lack of encounter design and lack of dungeon design. I've talked about this before. You can't really have something and not have a knock-on effect on other things. I actually just talked about this with regards to Head-On. I talked about this with Resident Evil 4. This is something that just keeps coming up. If you can't have a game that has really, really, really excellent combat, but then have bad enemy design, or bad encounter design, or bad level design, or bad itemization, or whatever, because then it's just like, there's nothing to do the combat against. There's nothing to enjoy it with. You've been given this really cool super soaker that has like this like splooshing water balloon shooting thing. And then you put it into a giant desert with no targets to hit. What's the fun in that, right? So the fact that the dungeon design isn't, and I'm saying it that way because it isn't. There's no dungeon design here to speak of. There's random pieces that are chunked together, and you get traps that are random, you get items that are random, you get Pokemon that are random. That's it. And you've got no encounter design because the aforementioned Pokemon are random, with the exception of the scripted encounters, which are the bosses. And one of the things I brought up during the stream was, why don't we just do manually crafted dungeons? Everybody hated that. Well, that's not true. Like all but like 2 people hated that. So I'm like, okay, hang on. Rather than destroy the core precept of the game, which in my opinion is ruining the rest of the game, why don't we try to come up with a way for this to work? What I came up with is to add depth and complexity to the randomization. Right now, when it pulls up a dungeon, it takes chunks of terrain and just kind of smashes them together. There's rooms, there's corridors, there's way too many corridors. Problem number 1, the corridors aren't interesting. There are very, very few tactics or strategies or anything you can do in a corridor. It's mostly just you facing the thing in front of you, you backing up to allow the other guy who is behind you to face the thing in front of you, or turning around and running, or having an item that changes up things. Like if you have, or if you have baton pass, for example, you can do something like that. That's kind of it. There's no tactics there. There's no positioning. There's no strategy. It's just push through the blockage, right? So honestly, nix the corridors entirely. I don't think they add anything to the format. But keep the rooms. Okay, so we've got randomly rooms selected together. Okay. This leads me to my next thing. Rather than make them just a square of non-interest, why don't we try to add some manually crafted stuff which randomly fits together? Maybe have a room, rather than just having like an environmental effect of weather that hits the entire floor, maybe have a thing where there's this one room and there's a few chunks of, rough terrain which slows you as you move through it. Or there's a rock in the middle of the room that serves as a blocker of line of sight. Or maybe there's a part of the room where there's this stuff coming off the wall, which can actually non-grass types, as they go by it, it'll leech them. But if you're a grass type, you'll actually leech of it. You can heal off of it or whatever. Environmental stuff, terrain, make the terrain matter. Craft these chunks of terrain and then mix and mash them so you get random chunks of whatever. Okay. So we've got the random dungeons. We've gotten rid of the corridors. We've added terrain. The next step would be to vary up encounter design. This one's a little bit trickier because the ideal way, in my opinion, to do this would be to have encounters set within a room. And they're just kind of stuck in that room effectively. Because it's not an encounter if you let them roam free. It effectively stops being a... Let me explain what I mean by that. I've talked a lot about encounter design, but encounter design, for those of you who haven't seen my other things, is, in brief, how you include what, where, and what you can do with it. So, terrain, what you have at your disposal, what the enemies are, and the combination of enemies. That's the encounter you've built, right? But if you build this crafted encounter here, and the enemies are just allowed to roam throughout the area and do whatever, then you have no longer built an encounter. All you've built is a bunch of random enemies that are roaming through forever. So there's no point in that. If you're going to do encounters, you have to have them within a room, right? If you're paying attention, the monster houses are similar to this, except not quite, because a monster house is once again just random. It's just pulling from a pool. But you could design encounters, and there's so many you can do with this. And you don't have to do it for every encounter, too. This is another idea. So let's do another little bit of a in-between kind of a thing, a little compromise. You could just have random Pokemon roaming the rooms. Cool. For catching, for example, and for getting items off of them, or just for grinding, or whatever, right? But then maybe every so often, you know how you have those mid-mission checkpoint moves, which is a good idea, by the way. Definite plus to the game. Maybe have, either right before or right after those, have a manually crafted mini-boss encounter. And thus, as you're going through there, it's okay, so now the creators, the developers can design combos. They can build, okay, so this Pokemon, which has this move and this move, but this IQ ability, which allows them to shoot through this person. So we put this person back here, and this move will allow them to shoot here, and this person is going to do the bodyguard thing. No, this person back here is going to do the bodyguard thing. So they're taking all the damage from the person up front, and so forth and so on, right? I'm not going to go down the specifics. You get the idea. So they could design that encounter, and then we have something a little more manually crafted and a little bit more thought out, in addition to just the random Pokemon roaming through the rooms. If all of this sounds terrible, then just throw my ideas out the window, because I got nothing else. The core precept of purely random rooms and purely random enemies, there's nothing I can do with that, because there's nothing you can do with that. That's just what it is, and that's fine. This is another thing, too. One of the things, obviously this isn't my thing, I think I've made that very clear, but I never gave a negative for the core level design. I didn't give it any positives, and it diminished other positives that might have happened, but I never actually dinged it for it, because I don't think it's bad in any real sense of the word, I just think it's absent. This is why I keep coming back to that word, design. I feel like this is Resident Evil 3 Remake all over again, because I just feel like there's whole areas that are just not designed, and considering this is the overwhelming percentage of gameplay, that kind of bothers me a little bit. But I heard several people on stream, and I encourage anybody in the comment section who is not trying to curse and scream at me, to go ahead and share any of your thoughts of why it is you like this particular thing, or why you don't, or maybe an idea you have to try and make this a little bit more in-depth and add a little bit more flavor and fun to the fact. Because I really wanted to like this game. From the moment I fired it up, just the animation and the music and the brilliant, gorgeous sprite work, lovely music, lovely just everything. Just, oh my god, I just fell in love with it almost immediately. And then I got to my first dungeon and I was like, oh, okay. And that's kind of this game in a nutshell, for me. This is why, even though this game didn't score relatively well, it still scored net positives, a net 28 on the golden number, but even though it scored net positively and didn't score very well, I could see why so many people love this game. And this is where we're going to talk about the story axis. There's also, I'm going to throw up the spoiler warning. Warning, 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 spoilers. Spoilers. Get your spoilers here. Okay, that's probably good enough. There are three big issues I had with the narrative. I want to talk about the negatives first, because I just want to get that out of the way. The first is the repetition. Now, there's three big issues I had with the game, and I want to get that out of the way first, because it's one of the biggest problems I had with the game overall, and I prefer to get rid of the negatives first, so we're going to talk about the three main issues I had with the game first, before we actually get into the rest. That way the negatives are gone, and we can discuss the rest of the story. Now, the first of those things that really bothered me, of the three things that bothered me within this game, I could keep going, is the repetition. I started reading the dialogue word for word out loud instead of on-the-fly editorializing, just so people would see what I was talking about. And several people in chat agreed with me. It's like, oh my god, I never realized just how much the game repeats itself over and over. Oftentimes, most often 3 times. Almost any given narrative beat, any given point is repeated 3 times back to back, just right after each other, like I was just pretending to do. And then, oftentimes it'll come up later, again. And oftentimes again after that. This is compounded by the fact that the game is in love with flashbacks. There are 3 big issues I had with the narrative. I want to talk about the negatives first, because I just want to get that out of the way. The first is the repetition. So, the game, flashbacks aren't necessarily a negative thing, really. But there was literally an instance where we had, oh my gosh, they left. Flashback. And it flashed back to the scene that we literally just left. Less than 1 minute prior. A period of time that can only be described as seconds prior was being flashbacked. This happens more than once. Why? We are not goldfish. I know goldfish don't even have memory that short, if I'm not mistaken, but why? Now, we had a discussion on this on stream, and between the repetition and the flashbacking, this by itself really dragged the narrative down for me by 4 points in the score, because it's insane. And I bring that up because we wondered if this was something that was done deliberately, or if this is a localization issue, or if this is a case of the script not being properly edited, which is actually a very common problem in a lot of video games and shows and movies, or if it's some combination thereof. If anybody has any insight, please feel free to share. But it felt like it several times where I'm just really like, oh my god. And then it would repeat itself, and I'm like, and it deflates. It removes the investment that I had. I hope you could at least tell it was obvious on camera, because a lot of people, while we were watching the stream, noticed that I was getting upset about it because of how much I was invested into the story, because of how much I was into it. But I mentioned 3 things, and those are the first 2, repetition and flashbacks. The third thing is something I'm going to start calling underthought. Now, underthought is a very important phrase that I've never actually used before on camera because I just came up with it a few days ago. But it's something I've noticed many times throughout the works of fiction. I'm glad to finally have a phrase. Thank you, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky, for finally giving me a phrase for this. Underthought is a very specific form of writing. I'm going to try and explain this by example rather than just try to word it out. There's an episode of Star Trek Voyager. And in this episode, someone's being mind controlled or replaced by an alien or whatever. It doesn't even matter. But they're not themselves, okay? So, in order to prove that, what the writer did was the writer wrote in a bit where the characters go to the device that scans everyone's brains on the ship constantly and then checked a record of their current brain scan versus their previous brain scan and said, aha, there you go, they're different. And then they moved on. This is never brought up before or since. This is underthought. And this is important because underthought doesn't just mean bad writing. Underthought is when a writer introduces something and doesn't think about it, doesn't explore it, doesn't expand upon it. For all intents and purposes, if you just ejected it from the narrative, nothing would change. Star Trek is rife with underthought, by the way. And so is Pokemon. In general, not just this game. There's a whole lot of aspects of Pokemon that they just did because it was fun or because they didn't think about it. And as the franchise has gone on and matured and they've done more concepts and styles of storytelling with it, these questions just start coming up. And this is the important distinction. Underthought is different from bad writing because underthought is specifically an absence of writing. Let me go back to that Star Trek example. Let's say that was an in-character point. Let's say that they acknowledge that in universe. Let's say one of the characters seeing that was like, oh my god, they're scanning our brains all the time. Isn't that a huge invasion of privacy? And then someone else could be like, well, yeah, but I mean, think about how many ways this could help us. Think about how this is for your protection. This is normal. Most Starfleet, facilities have this kind of scanning technology going at all times. It's to try and catch things like infiltrators or, mind control or shapeshifters or whatever. And of course, if anybody starts to have a mental or emotional breakdown, if they need mental help, we catch it immediately. There's just so many benefits to this. And you could make it a talking point. This is the distinction that a lot of people don't seem to understand when I raise these kind of issues. Because my issue is not the fact that there's a scanning thing scanning their brains. My issue is the fact that it doesn't matter because nobody thought about it. Now, this game does this several times, but I'm going to go and bring up one specific example of this, and if you either watch the stream or have played this game, you probably know the example I'm going to mention because it's apparently rather infamous. There's a bit in the story where we go off to get something for the Guildmaster, and we fail at it because we were sabotaged in the action. We come back and are disallowed from explaining ourselves, immediately told that we have to share in the punishment with our taskmaster, then forced to not only not eat dinner that night, but we then have to watch everyone else eat dinner while we are not allowed to eat dinner. On stream, we kept calling Wigglytuff's guild a cult, because that is cult behavior. It's actually a form of discipline that several cults have historically used. Now, this is a joke, because it's not being done deliberately. And you see the distinction. The fact that they're being that controlling, the fact that they're that domineering, doesn't actually bother me, as long as you do something with it. Maybe you could have had a narrative thread where the main character and the player character decide to flee. They're like, okay, we're done. We're not dealing with this nonsense anymore. We just want to go exploring. Maybe as they do so, they realize, oh, well, the guild was providing this and this and that. It's a lot more expensive to do this than we thought. Maybe you could say that the guild has to maintain this discipline because they used to have issues in the past with bad actors and bad Pokemon. And that's why they're so strict nowadays. There's all sorts of directions you could take that story idea if it was a story idea. But it's not. It only ever comes up if you fail the minigame and during that one particular story beat. And that's it. It's immediately dropped. Okay. It's almost immediately dropped and is almost never referenced again. The only almost there is the next morning your fellow cult members of the guild come by and say, hey, we saved some food for you, which is really a nice, heartwarming moment, actually. And again, if it had been acknowledged or developed, or maybe this is kind of a group thing, or maybe they're like, we need to go to Chatot and talk about how this is unacceptable behavior or whatever, Maybe even this is Chatot's decision against Wigglytuff's. Well, maybe Wigglytuff is actually against this idea to begin with. Maybe this is Wigglytuff's idea. I don't know. You could have done something with it. You didn't. Underthought. Make sense? And again, I don't want to come down too harshly on this game in particular, because Pokemon as an entire franchise has a whole lot of underthought. But, now that we've got my 3 big negatives out of the way, this game came so close. This is a world in which there's just dungeons that appear, and there's treasure at the end of them. Where's the dungeon come from? Where's the treasure come from? What's making it? What's designing it? What's placing it there? Who's placing the traps at the end of the dungeons? We see a lot of this during the Team Charm episode. You're probably thinking, Laura, you're just overthinking it. No, they're underthinking it is exactly my point. But hang on. What if we apply just a little bit of thought here? One of the ideas I posited was that there's a group of Pokemon just going around doing this. Setting up dungeons, placing treasure, and placing traps for fun. Not for themselves, but for the explorers. If you think about it, there's an actual, I forget what it's called, and I forgot about it on stream too. There's a specific term for this kind of non-sustainable economic model. It's when you send people to pull resources out of an area, and so they need support, and you need supply lines, and it just kind of builds its own economic hub of these people going and doing. It's something that Faerun does as well, actually, in the Forgotten Realms, with adventurers who form an entire economic backbone on their own, sometimes which works and sometimes doesn't, depending on the writer, but whatever. Similar concept. Now, hang on a second. Later on in the game, as we're going up the mountain, this is in post-game at this point, from the Shaman Village, we find out that there are Pokemon who have been deliberately going out of the way and carrying stuff and supplies up there just to support other Pokemon who are exploring. There's, in fact, an entire team whose only job in being there is to be a help, to be a support network for anybody who gets in trouble on the trip. We see several examples throughout the course of the game of Pokemon who go out of their way to just help others because they want to, because it's Pokemon. Because the general wholesomeness and positivity is kind of the point. So I don't think it's really that out of bounds to say that there's someone or someone's going around trying to set all of this stuff up for the explorers. By God, even the bad Pokemon in this game are almost entirely people who are just like a petty thief. Excuse me. And that's it. Like, that's what they do wrong, is they're like, you're going to steal this thing for me. Oh, I'm sorry. At one point in the game, this is, of course, spoilers, Drowsy, who kidnapped a child, was let go with a stern talking to, and legitimately worked to redeem himself after doing so. If that doesn't explain the overall tone of wholesomeness and positivity, I got nothing. You know, there's the old saying I used to say, that Pokemon is a world in which a 10-year-old can go out the front door, and they're fine with that. This is a similar example. A kidnapper redeemed themselves after a stern talking to. That's Pokemon. And that's throughout the whole game, too. Even the actual villains are a little bit kind of questionable in their villainy, especially Dusknoir, who, let's be honest with ourselves, is mostly just afraid of dying. That's another thing I want to complain about very briefly. The game very clearly means dying several times, but it always calls it, I'm going to get rid of you, or I'm going to disappear. But no, they mean killing. Anyways. There's several examples of that, but it still lines up perfectly, and Grovyle is actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about with the positivity thing. He is such an idealistic person. He is so willing to do the best he can, so selflessly, and willing to believe. He's effectively the Mario of the game. He is in many ways the secondary protagonist, right behind the main character. In my case, it was a Shinx, whereas I was playing a Bulbasaur, because apparently I'm a loner introvert. Anyways. Sure. Whatever. that never stopped amusing me. But, he plays the Mario of the work. The way that he redeems Dusknoir actually worked quite well for me. Because it made perfect sense that Dusknoir, who simply didn't want to die, wasn't thinking about how miserable they were. There's an old saying, which I'm just going to go ahead and claim it's my own quote, even though it's totally not. Because the original quote is actually different. The way I keep repeating it is different. So whatever. It's my quote now. Survival is insufficient. And there's a lot of that going on in the entire Grovile arc, the hidden chapter, or whatever they actually call that, where the whole point is that they were not willing to just sit by and be. They wanted to live. In fact, the exact wording they use is they wanted to shine. And there's just something kind of awesome about that. About how Dusk Noir wants so badly to believe in a possibility of living, even if it's for less time, that he's willing to, let's call it what it is, commit suicide. It's not like just taking a dagger to your knife kind of, or dagger to your neck kind of a thing. But it is I'm willing to prevent myself from ever being born kind of a thing. The final moments they have are probably the most powerful scene in the entire game for me. No joke. I actually started choking up. Go ahead, make fun. They've beaten Primal Dialga, and they're just there, and they're fading away because time is reverting itself. And as they're fading, it's like, tell me that I shine. Tell me that at my final moments I lived. And Grovile goes over to hold Celebi, and it's like, it's okay. I'm happy we did this. It was worth it. It was worth it. I'm happy now. Whoosh! And then they're gone. And then they're brought back one scene later. That's my final complaint about the narrative, and I dinged it both times they do this. There are two scenes in this game which are extraordinarily powerful. Both of them involve death. One involves their sacrifice that I just mentioned. One involves the player character's sacrifice after the defeat of Dialga in the present. Both of these scenes are powerful, impacting, and awesome, and both of them are completely undone by the fact that they're just, oh yeah, no, sacrifice undone. You're fine, go home. But despite not having the cojones to actually follow through on that, and of course, they'd probably never be allowed to, right? Of course, it still has to be an E for everyone game. And I believe this actually is rated E for everyone. The game touches on a lot of rather dark, what I call dark topics, mature topics. Obviously, there's several aspects of identity on display, as I already just mentioned, and wanting to live, wanting to be the most that you can. But there's two other ones I wanted to mention in specific. One has to do with, I'm trying to think how to properly phrase this. It has to do with being capable and willing to move on. This is more of a subplot, but it's there repeatedly, and there's several scenes in several quests which are all about acknowledging and accepting that things have moved on and you now have to move on. Probably the most powerful single moment of this is the Manafie Arc, where we have a Manafie egg and we have to go and get 2 blue gummies. Negative to gameplay. But after we go do that, we have this heart-rending moment where we have to let them go. We have to say goodbye to them because we have to, because it's for their own good, because it's for their safety, their health, and their future. There's a lot of saying goodbye in this game if you actually pay attention, which of course brings me to the other one. During the Darkrai arc, which honestly kind of sucked overall, if I'm just being completely honest. Hi, I was behind everything all along. Yeah, sure thing, the jailer. Not to insult this game, but the point is, there's this wonderful bit where the main character, Sphinx, in my case, I called him Loke after one of the viewers. Sphinx has gotten to the point where he started thinking about committing suicide. In this case, actually killing himself. Because Darkrai, who has been disguising himself as Cresselia, has been trying to convince him that he is the problem and he is what's causing the world to be terrible and his death will save the world. Okay, that's wonderfully, horrifyingly dark. And obviously both Sphinx and the Bulbasaur, the two characters, are struggling with this and trying to figure out how to deal with this, how to process this, because both of them kind of agree this. And this is where the localization / dialogue problem comes in. The game doesn't properly explore the idea that is presented there. It does follow through on the idea, but it doesn't present the idea in the first place. Because after we figured out that this is a trick, the Sphinx, the main character, says, I started to think that the world didn't want me. I thought that the world would be a better place if I wasn't in it. Now tell me, does that sound familiar? And, of course, what happens is a massive rejoinder of a large group of people who just embrace him immediately and say, no, don't worry. We would be sad if you were gone. It's an extraordinarily well-constructed moment, which is a shame that it wasn't built up properly. But it's still there. And that, I think, is how I'm going to end this particular rumination. The core nugget of this game, especially on the story and narrative axis, is so good. Like I said, this is one of the best Pokemon stories I've ever experienced. Easily up there with Black and White 1, which is the other big one for me. It is, however, hampered by itself. I would love to be able to go through and just do an editing pass or 2 or 3 on the text to polish up some of these issues and just present the ideas the game itself is introducing a little bit better, you know? Which is why I hope we never get a remaster of this game, and I hope instead that we get a remake of this game, because that would be awesome, even if we keep the stupid blue gummies in. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts, as always. I'm gonna go get some lunch. I'll see you next time.